Although a lot of it is his fault due to his personal actions, it's a shame that Isiah Thomas isn't mentioned historically in the same breath as Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, and Michael Jordan. He really should be in that conversation. And even I believe I have been historically underrating Isiah Thomas. As I read more and more about the earlier years of his career, the early to mid 80s, more I read about him, the more I realize that I've been underrating him. The last time I did this list, I had him at number 4. I had John Stockton number 3. I think in those days, and prior to that, I was still more enthralled with statistical achievement over, actual dominance. And sometimes numbers can be misleading. You can look at John Stockton, you can look at the field goal percentage, look at Isiah Thomas's field goal percentage, but you will come to the conclusion that he was a better player, a better scorer, but that's not the case. Stockton was the better shooter. That can't be denied. But Stockton was very selective with the shots that he took, whereas Isiah Thomas, often being the primary scorer for the Pistons, especially early in his career, and he was, often, the killer, as James like to say, that killer. He didn't shy away from going and down, in the paint and challenging the Giants, and being the fact he was only 6'1", that did have an effect on his field goal percentage. But then again, 45% is not that bad when you compare it to today's era. 45.2% is not that bad. Look, Ray Allen's one of the greatest shooters ever. He shot 45% from the floor. Kobe Bryant, 44.7%. Latrell Sprewell, I think, was like 44.4% or something like that, 44.5%. Tracy McGrady was only 43% for his career. So that's not really that bad. But Isiah Thomas, listed 6'1", 180 pounds. Really, he was a little bit just over 6 feet in height. But he was arguably, and it is still in many people's opinion, pound for pound, the best little man that ever played and the best point guard that ever played in the NBA. Now, the reason why most list Magic over him is because Magic was just so unique and so dominant at the point guard position that you have to rate him over him. But Isiah Thomas had so many things going for him that he really didn't have any weaknesses. The only weakness that he sort of had was perhaps his outside shooting, but he did improve on that as he got older. But he was never a guy that was like a knockdown three-point shooter. But what he could do was phenomenal. Number one, individually, he was tenacious. He was tough. He didn't back down from anybody. There's always that clip that you could see of him going up against his former teammate Rick Mahorn. Rick Mahorn was, 6'10" and 265 pounds or so, 270 maybe at the time, I don't know. And even though the punch didn't connect, he tried to knock Rick Mahorn's block off. He was behind that smile, and the nice demeanor. He was an assassin. He was a killer. But also, not just from personality standpoint and the alpha male standpoint, because he was the leader of those teams, but he also had game. He was a one-on-one virtuoso. ISO-wise, when need be, he could break down a defense. He had the speed. He had the ball handling ability. He had the shot-making ability. Mid-range. He had a really good mid-range game. He was able to get his shot off against, even though he was a smaller guy, he was able to get his shot off against bigger defenders. He had great handles. He had the crossover. I mean, it wasn't as advanced as the crossovers are today, but he had that basic crossover. But it was quick, and like I said, one-on-one, he was a killer. But this is the thing that separated him from other players. He was also blessed with a very high basketball IQ, and he was an actual, real, true point guard. He made players around him better. He could get the ball to guys on the floor to make them better offensively, and he was a great floor general, and most importantly, he could control the tempo and the pace of the game. The Pistons, if you look at their rosters, during their heyday, they didn't have the most talented offensive players all the time on the court. But Isiah Thomas, being the floor general, could control the pace of a game to favor his team. Detroit won by their physical defense, and they won by usually winning the battle in the trenches. Bill Laimbeer was a great rebounder. Dennis Rodman became an all-time great rebounder. Rick Mahorn was a pretty good rebounder. They had a lot of guys that could rebound the basketball. They had great individual defenders on that team. Bill Laimbeer was a thug. Bill Laimbeer was dirty as hell. Joe Dumars was the best perimeter defender in the NBA, at least for a couple of years. The best perimeter defender in the NBA, arguably at least. Dennis Rodman was seen as the best all-around defensive player in the league. At one point when he was with Detroit, he could literally guard all 5 positions. John Salley was a great defensive player. Then they had Bill Laimbeer. Bill Laimbeer offensively could be a mismatch because he could hit the outside three. That was something that was very unique in that time. James Edwards had a nice little turnaround fall-away jumper. They had they had a lot of good pieces. Mark Aguirre, good scorer. And earlier, of course, they had Adrian Dantley, but then the championship years, they had Mark Aguirre. And because they were able to control the pace of the game and usually win the rebounding battle, even if they were going up against a more explosive team, generally like the Lakers or some team like maybe the late 80s, early 90s Suns, who had all those great scores, they were able to beat teams like that because they could just control the pace and they could shut down the other team's best player, either through physical defense or that plus intimidation. Rules were a lot more lenient back then, and the Pistons were playing thug ball, to the point where league darlings, and it wasn't just, even though people like to bring up the Bulls, and the Bulls were the biggest adversary for Detroit at that time in the Eastern Conference after the demise of the Sixers and eventually the Celtics. But it wasn't just the Bulls complaining about the Pistons. Everybody was complaining about them. The Bulls were maybe the loudest, but everybody complained about them. Charles Barkley talked about this. Everybody complained about them. They thought it wasn't really basketball. Everybody outside of Detroit hated the Pistons. But Isiah Thomas was a remarkable player. That can't be denied. He wasn't beloved outside of Detroit. And that unfortunately led to a lot of snubs. Most importantly, that led to him not being picked for the dream team. And it's messed up because he deserved to be on that team. I don't care what those guys' personal feelings. Look, I understand from a basketball standpoint They said, well, if they put him on the team, it would mess up team chemistry or whatever. Look, I mean, I could see that, but look, Dennis Rodman was hated in Chicago or disliked in Chicago for a while, for many years. Pippen hated and disliked Dennis Rodman for his physical play, the things he did to him back when he was in Detroit. But all it took was Dennis Rodman to apologize to Scottie Pippen. All right? And that was it. And then the rest is history. If it was that bad, don't you think that Isiah Thomas... This is why I think it gets a little selfish with the players. Don't you think the NBA fans would have preferred seeing Isiah Thomas rather than John Stockton? I know they say, look, John Stockton would have been a better fit because he was a pure passer. But at the end of the day, Isiah Thomas did deserve to be on that team. Okay, he deserved to be on that team. And at the end of the day, there's really no excuse for it. Honestly. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I understand the arguments against it, but at the end of the day, he should have been on that team. But Isiah Thomas was born in Chicago in 1961. And that's another thing that's very ironic. He was from Chicago, born in Chicago, but ultimately he became hated in Chicago by a city that preferred a guy that wasn't even from Chicago, from North Carolina, born in Brooklyn. But he became a god in Chicago while, Isiah Thomas was hated in his own hometown. But Isiah Thomas was a basketball prodigy. And after high school, he took 2 schools seriously nearby. DePaul, where his childhood friend Mark Aguirre went. Mark Aguirre ultimately would play in the NBA with Isiah Thomas. It would be, as I mentioned him before, he'd be a teammate of Isiah's with the Pistons. But ultimately, he chose to go to Indiana, despite the fact that friends and even family members told him not to go there. They were telling him that Bobby Knight was a racist. Bobby Knight was, not a good guy. Not a good guy to play for. But ultimately, Indiana probably was the right choice. Playing under a Bobby Knight did instill one good thing in Isiah Thomas, and that was the team was always more important than the individual. And that's why Isiah Thomas became such a great teammate over his career. Even though individually he could have put up better numbers. He could have averaged 25 points a game if he chose to. But then again, Detroit might not have won 2 championships. So that coaching instilled in him that the team was always to be number one over the individual. They won a championship, an NCAA championship in 1981. Isiah Thomas was second overall in the draft in 1981. A lot of people talk about the 96 draft, the 84 draft, the 2003 draft, but the 1981 draft was not shabby either. When you look at the 1981 NBA draft, it had Isiah Thomas, of course, Mark Aguirre, who was a big scorer for the Dallas Mavericks in the 80s, and later on a pretty good player with the Pistons. That draft also had Tom Chambers, Buck Williams. Who else is in that draft? Danny Ainge was in that draft. Danny Shays, the son of NBA legend Dolph Shays, was in that draft. Who else was in that draft? There were some other players. Well, that can't come to me right now, but there were some other players in that draft. It was a really good overall NBA draft. Isiah Thomas didn't win Rookie of the Year. That went to Buck Williams. But he had the first couple. But I'll play this. He did instantly improve that franchise. They went from being like a team that was, let's say 34-48, to being a team that was 7th, 8th seed at least. They were definitely improved by his presence. I know when he first got there. Oh, that's the other guy that was drafted that year along with him, Kelly Tripucka. Kelly Tripucka, who was his teammate at first with the Pistons, was also in that draft. A lot of people my age might remember Kelly Tripucka for being with the Charlotte Hornets, but Kelly Tripucka also played with Isiah Thomas at that time. Kelly Tripucka in a game with the Pistons set a scoring mark that stood for many years until Jerry Stackhouse broke it during the 2000-2001 season, the 56 points. But at this time, the Pistons were a good team, but they weren't great. During the 1984 NBA playoffs, there was an epic series between the Detroit Pistons and the New York Knicks. At that time, the Knicks were Bernard King's team. And I think during that series went 5 games. I think Bernard King dominated that series. I think he averaged something like close to 40 points a game in that series. I think. But it was game 5, was it? I think it was game 5. Someone can fact check me on this. Where Isiah Thomas scored 16 points in like the final 90 seconds of that game, going into overtime, but Isiah Thomas fouled out. I think it was game 5, and the Knicks went on to win that series, and then they were going to probably lose to maybe Boston or something like that. But from 1985 to 87, the Detroit Pistons could not get over the hump when it came to the Boston Celtics. The Celtics were to the Pistons what the Pistons would be to the Bulls a few years later. But the Pistons also showed, the Celtics also showed the Pistons what it took to be a championship level team. In 1985, I think they lost in 6 in the semis to the Boston Celtics. And in 1987, they went to the Eastern Conference Finals. And this is when the Bad Boy Pistons were starting to come into fruition, Chuck Daly was the coach by then, had been the coach a couple years by then. Bill Laimbeer had long since been there, coming over from the Cleveland Cavaliers. That year, the Pistons acquired both John Sally and Dennis Rodman, and I believe they also acquired Rick Mahorn that year. Might have been that year or the year before. So the Bad Boy Pistons were coming to fruition, and they went to the Eastern Conference Finals, and they had Game 5 won, if I'm not mistaken. I think they had Game 5 won, and if they had won that game, I believe they would have been up 3-2 going into Detroit, if my memory serves me correctly. They had that game won. They stopped Larry Bird on the goal line. If you remember that last play when Bird tried to make something out of nothing, they stuffed him. All Isiah had to do was inbound the basketball, run out the clock, and that would have been it. But Isiah Thomas said that he made a mental mistake. He kind of just checked out the game for 1 second and just threw like a basic, soft pass. But Bird was always in tune to the game at all seconds. And that taught Isiah Thomas a lesson, he said. And, Bird stole the ball, gave it to DJ. We all know what happened with that play. So the Pistons wound up losing that series. But the Pistons were coming. The Celtics, I said the Birds. The Celtics were plateauing as a team. They had injury issues in '87, but they made it to the finals. By 1988, Bird's own personal injuries were taking a toll on him by the playoffs. They shut down Larry Bird in that series in 88 in the conference. They shut Bird down to only 10 points a game. I think they beat Boston in 6 games, although a lot of it was because of Bird having issues with bone spurs and back issues. But still, they shut Larry Bird down. They made it to the NBA Finals. And during that Finals, it was an epic series that went 7 games. And Detroit fans will tell you to this day that they got cheated out of an NBA championship. I have to say, man, I do think that was a phantom call on Bill Laimbeer, man. Like, I've watched that game so many different times, and I hate Bill Laimbeer, but that wasn't a foul on Bill Laimbeer, but whatever. The next year, the Pistons were able to go back to the finals. Laker fans will talk about how they didn't have Magic after, game 1. They didn't have Byron Scott through the whole series. But the Pistons swept the Lakers in 4 and won their first ever NBA championship. The next year, they would go 59-23. That year, they had won 63-19. They go 59-23 the next year. And they make it to the NBA Finals for the 3rd year in a row. And they beat the Portland Trailblazers in 5. In fact, they had an easier time of it than they did the Chicago Bulls, who went 7 games with them in the Eastern Conference Finals. And speaking of the Bulls, everybody thinks of the Bulls when they think about the Pistons. And I know I'm getting away from Isiah Thomas, but I just want to mention a couple things. This is the thing about it, though. To me, the Bad Boys really began to start implementing the Jordan rules after the Bulls traded Charles Oakley. Charles Oakley was the enforcer. All right, people forget about Charles Oakley. 85, 86, 86, 87. Well, excuse me, 86, 87, 87, 88. When Jordan was scoring 37 and 35 points a game, Charles Oakley was his teammate. In those seasons, Charles Oakley was averaging 12 points, 13 rebounds, 3 assists, 2 or 3 assists. He was the Bulls enforcer. He was the top enforcer, really, to be honest with you, in the NBA. And it's funny how when Charles Oakley was on that team, Jordan was scoring he was honestly destroying the Pistons. He had a 61-point game in late 87. On a national televised game in 1988, he scored 59 points. He had multiple 40-point games against him during this time period. But it wasn't until Jerry Krause and management traded Charles Oakley on June 27th, 1988. Pretty much in exchange for Bill Cartwright, who was not an enforcer, not known for, his physical intimidation or rough out tactics or strength or being able to fight. And they knew that without his muscle there was a weakness, a gaping weakness. Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant, these guys were rookies. Now they could initiate these rules, these tactics, and that's what happened. And basically what it was to keep Jordan out of the paint. Keep Jordan out of the paint and take away his driving lanes as much as possible. Or if he did attempt these things, make it bloody hell for him to pay. And while they didn't shut Jordan down, I always hear people say they shut him down. They didn't shut him down, but Jordan was playing into their hands. Meaning he was trying to force the issue, you can't stop me, blah, 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 blah. And while he did still average 30 points a game during these years, the Jordan Rule years, the Pistons were beating the shit out of the Bulls because Jordan didn't trust his teammates. And he did average 30 points, but he also only shot 47% from the floor, which for that era was pretty low for Jordan. And the Pistons really, really made it tough for Jordan to the point where it is true, if the Bulls didn't win a title in 1991, Jordan might have either retired or, knowing him, he might have requested a trade. I don't know whether these are some things that are set in frustration, but I did read these things. But for a minute, man, the Detroit Pistons owned basketball. But the funny thing about it, too, Isiah Thomas and the Pistons, they were not, the NBA kind of saw them as in the way. They much prefer teams like the Lakers and the Bulls and the Sixers and, Celtics. They much prefer teams like that. They didn't like the rough house tactics, and ultimately there is a conspiracy theory by some Pistons fans, okay? And this conspiracy theory is that the NBA purposely created these new franchises, the Charlotte Hornets and the Miami Heat, the Timberwolves, during that time period, Orlando Magic. A lot of Detroit Pistons fans feel like they created these franchises just to have an excuse through the expansion draft to dilute that Pistons team. And it is funny that some of those players were ultimately jettisoned to other franchises. You know what I'm saying? Although some of it can't be because of that, because Rick Mahorn, they just chose not to re-sign him. But John Sally was traded vis-a-vis expansion draft from the Pistons to the Heat, if I'm not mistaken. So certain pieces of that team were broken up. So that's a little bit of a theory right there, and that the league did not like the Detroit Pistons because they kind of got in the way of the coronation of King Michael I. So, look, in hindsight, Isiah Thomas was a very, very, very great player, all right, who honestly doesn't get his due. He's disliked by a lot of people. He was controversial. I'm just being honest, man. I'm not just going to sugarcoat every fucking thing. He had ties to the Detroit Mafia. Yes, you can look it up. He had ties to Detroit Mafia. He had ties to gangs. But at the same time, he also did a lot of things to try to improve his local community. He did a lot of things for the black community, which is something that Michael Jordan really never did when he was playing. So there's good and bad in everybody, and there's good and bad in Isiah Thomas. I think the most tragic thing, though, was the fact that his friendship with Magic Johnson deteriorated so much. And a lot of it was because of hearsay. You know what I'm saying? Especially on Magic end. I heard, people come to Magic and say, I heard Isiah talking trash about you, saying that you're gay, and the reason why you got HIV is because you da-da-da and this. And, Magic was hearing all these rumors and found out that it was his supposed best friend going around talking about him. So that's why I said, some of the reasons why he's disliked is his own. It's his own fault. Some of it is unfair, though. But all in all, he's a tremendous player, man. He won 2 NBA championships. Twice he was the All-Star Game MVP. He was the 1990 NBA Finals MVP. He led the league in assists in 84-85. In a decade that was dominated by Magic Johnson and John Stockton as far as assist champions, he led the league in assists in 84-85. That was probably his best statistical season. I think that year he averaged 24 points, almost 14 assists. He might have even led the league in steals that year too. He set a record that year for assists, 1,123, that would stand until John Stockton had his 2 best years. As a matter of fact, Isiah Thomas is one of only 3 players to have a season with at least 1,000 assists. The other 2 being John Stockton, who did it 7 times, and I think Kevin Porter, did it twice. That's another underrated point guard from the 1970s, Kevin Porter. Not to be confused with Terry Porter. But he averaged, for his career, over 19 points, over 9 assists per game, and almost 2 steals per game. He could have scored more, like I said, if he chose to, but, he played within the team. And, he's a top 50 player. I used to have Isiah Thomas in, the top 30, but over time, I've started pushing him up further. I'm pushing him more toward the top 20 than the top 30 because I think I've been underrating him a lot. So I have to kind of look at my list. I got to do some rearranging with some players too, man, because over time you could change your opinion. You know what I'm saying? A lot of people kill me on YouTube, man, when they criticize you like, wait a minute, man, you a flip-flopper. No, motherfucker, I can change my mind. Everything isn't etched in stone. Some things are fluid. You can change your mind. As you observe different things, read more evidence, become, aware of certain things, you can change your fucking mind. But that's pretty much it, man. Number 3, Isiah Thomas. Tell me what you guys think.